This is the third Instagram Live that this group is doing together. We have, for those of you who are just catching up with us, already done one on distress tolerance, that module in DBT. We have already done one on mindfulness. And today's chapter is on emotion regulation. Before we jump in, I'd love to ask our panelists to do quick introductions for themselves. Then we're going to do a quick mindfulness exercise. We have some opener questions that I will pose, and then anybody who is here is welcome to ask questions, and we will get those questions answered. So just to kick us off, quick introductions. Kiki, let me turn it over to you.
Great. Hi, I'm Dr. Kiki Fehling. I use they, she pronouns, and I am a Linehan board certified expert DBT clinician, but currently on sabbatical, but I love doing this stuff. So here we are.
Awesome.
All right,
Alicia,
I'll start next. Dr. Alicia Smart, clinical psychologist, Linehan board certified in DBT, co-founder of TheraHive with Jesse and Roland. And yeah, I'll pass it to Jesse.
Hi, Dr. Jesse Finkelstein, pronouns he, him. Also co-founder of TheraHive. Cool.
Okay, awesome. I am Roland. I'm going to be serving a little bit as a moderator here today, helping facilitate this conversation. I also am part of the TheraHive team and everybody here. With that, I think now is a good time. The first two of these that we did, or the last one we did rather, was mindfulness. And because of that, we did a mindfulness exercise. And that was such a wonderful experience that I asked if Alicia would do another mindfulness to kick this one off, even though this isn't technically the mindfulness episode. So Alicia, let me turn it over to you to take it away.
Mindfulness is welcomed most times to get present and oriented to the being in the moment. So if everyone could join me in this quick little mindfulness, you can start by just taking a breath, noticing your inhale and exhale out. And then I actually welcome you to open your eyes if they're closed and just scan the room that you're in for a moment and notice 5 things that you see and name those things to yourself. And once you have noticed those 5 things, you can bring yourself back to your breathing. Inhaling and exhaling. And then expanding your awareness to your sense of touch. So noticing 4 things that you can feel. Might be on you or nearby.
Alicia, I think we lost you.
Your sense of hearing. So noticing 3 things that you can hear. One might be the sound of my voice. Might be outside the room or in the room. And once you've done that again, you can always come back to your breathing. And then expanding your awareness to your sense of smell. Maybe smelling something on you or nearby. Again, going back to our breath. And then lastly, if you have something to taste, like a glass of water or tea or something, I welcome you to do that. If not, just ending with a deep inhale and a slow exhale out.
Awesome. Thank you.
You're welcome. And I'm sorry about that. I think I did glitch out there for a second, but here I am.
We got you.
All right.
No distress tolerance needed today. Yet.
Good.
Okay. So with that, it's probably a good opportunity for us to transition, talk about emotion regulation. That's our topic. And Kiki, if you could start us off just by giving us kind of an overview. What is emotion regulation and DBT?
Yeah. So emotion regulation is the largest module of the DBT skills, and we normally talk about it having four main parts or like categories of skills. The first is kind of feeling your feelings, understanding and identifying your emotions, getting more in touch with using emotional language and really understanding emotions deeply in that way. Second set of skills is reducing unwanted emotions. So these are the skills that I'm sure we'll talk about: opposite action, problem solving, like we're feeling something that we don't want to be feeling, whether because it's unpleasant or not helping us right now, and skills to help us reduce those emotions. Third category is skills for reducing emotional vulnerability. So we understand that emotions come from a place that are influenced by like everything else in our lives that are happening, how happy we are in general, how stressed we are in general, our physical health, and the skills in that category help us focus on that and improve our emotional resilience by reducing emotional vulnerability. And then finally, the fourth category we talk about as being reducing emotional suffering. So this is also feeling our emotions and basically learning how to make decisions about how we want to respond to our emotions overall, and reducing kind of well, there's a couple different things, but not clinging to emotions, not amplifying them, managing them in ways that feel effective and skillful for us.
Okay, that's great. That's an awesome overview. I think a next natural question for people is how, given that we're talking about the different modules, how does emotion regulation relate to the other modules within DBT?
I think that it relates in the way that all of the skills are interrelated with one another. You might be picking and choosing all sorts of things from all the modules to deal with different situations. So, for example, mindfulness is always there. In order to know how you're feeling, you have to be aware and mindful of what your situation is, what body sensations I'm feeling, what action urges I'm having, etc. If you're feeling really, really intense emotions, you might want to dabble in distress tolerance skills, particularly crisis survival skills, before engaging in other emotion regulation skills. And then obviously for some emotions, they get triggered or prompted by interpersonal interactions, other people. And so interpersonal effectiveness is often going to be a really effective skill set to use to cope with, reduce, use various emotions.
Okay, awesome. One of the questions that came in when we first scheduled this was about when to apply emotion regulation skills. And it was a question about could they be applied in a crisis, or should I use distress tolerance? Can you speak to that, somebody?
Yeah, I mean, typically when we're thinking about crisis survival skills, right, we're thinking about like our emotional temperature, and if we're at the higher end of our temperature, right, some of the emotion regulation skills actually require some thinking and some reasonable mind and wise mind on board in order to be effectively using them. So if we're in crisis and emotionally distressed, or it's actually too overwhelming to use more complicated skills, then using those crisis distress tolerance skills are going to be really helpful first before engaging in emotion regulation.
Yes, and I think mindfulness of current emotions is the one skill where that, or maybe not necessarily the one, but where that gets a little more complicated, because I have found, both for myself and for folks that I've worked with, and I'd be curious to hear from you, Kiki and Alicia, that skill is in fact a really helpful one that folks can use when they're in crisis situations. Insofar as, and just for folks who are unfamiliar with this skill, mindfulness of current emotions is basically riding the emotional wave. It is a practice of experiencing your emotions, noticing both the sort of ebb and flow without necessarily holding on or really trying to push it away, so that we can sort of come to this understanding that we can experience something without it necessarily destroying us.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And I think dialectically, right, ideally we want to be able to do that, to surf all the waves of the emotions, right, as opposed to pushing them away or feeling like we need to just like distract or self-soothe and not feel the feelings. And what if the wave is a tsunami, right? If the wave is a tsunami, then we may not be able to surf it, right? Then we may need still to bring it down. I see you pondering that, right? Or maybe the tsunami is an urge that's going to make it worse. And like in terms of like finding a more effective thing to do to keep me from doing something that I know is going to be making the problem bigger.
Mm-hmm. That does speak to another question. I don't know if this helped frame that question for you, Jesse, but there is another related question here about like emotion regulation implies that we can regulate our emotions. Does that simply mean dialing up and down how we feel about them, or does it mean actually changing the emotions we're feeling?
Well, I think dialing up and down is a way of changing the emotion as well. I mean, the way that I like to think about it is, to some extent, like, you have these sort of orchestra or or symphony of sensations and experiences happening at any given moment, and we sort of want to treat our emotions as sort of tools that we can play with to help us move towards our goals and to help us also provide information along that path. But the tsunami of emotion though, I'm like still thinking about that for a second, because I think about like, we don't have to get into, but I am sort of curious, like there's the mindfulness of current thoughts, which is sort of also positioned in the distress tolerance. So for folks, it's very similar to mindfulness of current emotions, except in that instance, we're looking at thoughts and sort of noticing thoughts as they come in and out of our mind without necessarily becoming fused or too attached to them. And I do find that, at least in my experience working with emotions, a similar effort to sort of distance can function both as a helpful sort of emotion regulation skill, and Kiki, to what you had said earlier, a way of reducing emotional suffering, and I don't know, I mean, Alicia and Kiki, like, have you found that for certain folks, when they are at, let's say, a 10, they have difficulty practicing that skill?
Yeah.
Like it's just flooding.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I guess that's where I'm coming from. I think that when I talk to clients about sitting with their feelings, that's the absolute last thing they want to be doing. And they will be doing anything to actually escape the feeling. And so, in those situations, going toward the stress tolerance as opposed to, maybe something self-destructive or some desperate measure to get rid of the feeling. But to your point, Jesse, ultimately we want to do emotional exposure to be able to be with our feelings and know that they're not going to kill us and that they're not actually going to destroy us, or that we're not going to, the idea of having a panic attack, many people who have anxiety, right, they have fear that they're going to have more anxiety, right? And so they have anxiety about anxiety, and then it's like building, right? So to be able to sit and accept the anxiety, to soften around the anxiety, ultimately, yeah, that's the goal, right? We want to be able to be with what is, but it is.
Part of what I'm hearing is that maybe there's also just like actual surfing. When you first start, you can only surf on really small waves. And, it takes a lot of courage as somebody who has tried to surf. It takes a lot of courage to actually go surfing in big waves. Like, it is very, very difficult, and it is pretty scary. And waves are incredibly powerful. Like, they can wreck you if you aren't careful. So maybe part of what I think I'm hearing is that you're saying, like, for most people, there are waves that are too big to surf, but maybe for people who get really advanced and who are very competent with these skills, or even approaching mastery, they're going to get to a place where they can come close to surfing most any wave.
I think that's well said. I love the tsunami metaphor. I hadn't heard that before, and I think it's really appropriate because, like, in reality, objectively, we would not surf in a tsunami, right? Like, that would be a bad idea. But with emotions, it's not quite as black and white. And so I think that's a great point that for some people, a 5 out of 10 emotion when they're starting in DBT, particularly, for example, might feel like a tsunami, and like just out of their comfort zone, past their window of tolerance, right? But then eventually, like the Dalai Lama, I'm not even going to claim it myself, but the Dalai Lama can probably like ride the wave of, I don't know, you have to ask him, but I imagine he can probably ride the wave of most emotional experiences he has.
So actually, Kiki, this was the thought I was having, which is like, is there a world in which we are moving towards emotional exposure and mindfulness of current emotions? Is that the trajectory?
Yeah.
Probably. I mean, I think skillful means comes to mind for me here too. The balance of doing and being, even when you brought up like emotion regulation, Jesse, being like taking your emotions to work towards goals. A lot of times, like, it's also okay just to view emotions just are, right? And not all emotions are unpleasant. Not all emotions need like cognition and figuring out and intentional, like wise mind, like conscious, like figuring out. A lot of times, wise mind in skillful means and wise mind and emotion mind, reasonable mind is just being in the motion. It feels like flow, like, and I think that is the goal of, you might naturally act opposite or problem solve according to the emotion when you're just mindful in it. I do think that's the goal, to get to that point where everything is kind of everything and just participating.
I love how quickly this group has just gone headfirst into this topic. I want to just take a moment to pause and say, for those people who are on the feed, please ask questions. We have a list of common questions, but I'm watching the comments and I'd love to see your questions if you have them. Before we go deep, I'd love to take 1 or 2 questions to bring us back up to the top to make sure people have like an overview understanding of emotion regulation. One of the questions that we had was, how does improving emotional regulation improve daily life and mental well-being? Like, just how does it fit into my daily practice and improve my state of being? Who wants to take that? Jesse, let's hear from you. Go ahead.
The way that I think about this, there's this neuroscientist, Dr. Alicia Barrett, who I'm a huge fan of, who talks a lot about sort of like our emotional bank account. Or not just not even our emotional bank account, just like our like physiological bank account. Like, we're constantly trying to not run at a deficit. And deficits look like, not getting enough sleep, not getting, proper nutrition, not engaging in regular exercise. So essentially what we're doing is we're sort of removing things that would otherwise like increase our sort of physiological bank account, so that when inevitably withdrawals will come, like bad shit's going to happen, we don't necessarily have the resources to spend on tolerating and being with that. So, when Kiki, you were sort of breaking down some of the components of emotion regulation, you identified this one component, which is oftentimes captured by like the please skills, which is a really judgment here, clunky acronym, that is very much about sort of like, how do we reduce our vulnerability to unwanted emotion? And so what is it that we need to do in order to make this bank account sort of at a surplus, so that when things do end up happening, we don't go into withdrawal, or we don't go into a deficit. I'm not an accountant. There's a reason why I had to go into like investment banking, but I think something basically you don't want to bankrupt your body essentially. But and yeah.
Right. Well, and that
what was your question?
allows you to be more resilient. I mean, basically
Yes.
is what you're saying, right, Jesse? It's like, if we have, money in the bank, so to speak, we can ride, the ups and downs of life, the things that happen. And so that the importance of like being able to make sure that we are taking care of our body, take care of our mind, so to speak. I think the other piece around this question, understanding our emotions and being able to see them as data points, that the emotion, like, we're having emotion for a reason. I mean, sometimes it's because I didn't eat lunch and I'm now hangry, but sometimes it's because, I'm feeling frustration and anger, because my boundaries are being crossed, or because I'm not setting a limit here, or something's happening that I need to pay attention to, right? And so being able to develop curiosity and understanding of like, oh, what can I do with this information? Is this useful information for me? Or maybe not. Maybe I need to check the facts and I actually am reacting to an assumption, right?
It feels like you're connecting emotion regulation right now to some of the core mindfulness skills that we covered last week, actually, in terms of the ability to not just feel what we're feeling, but also to like label them, observe them, try and connect them to the other things that are going on. We have a really good question that came in here from Chantal. How do you navigate situations where you're emotionally regulated, you are emotionally regulated, but the people around you are not? How can we support them in managing their emotions, especially in conversations or conflicts?
Yeah. So yeah, this comes up a lot when I work with family members of folks with mental health struggles, but obviously it comes up with folks that are coming to me with mental health struggles too, and because we all interact with people and everyone has emotions. I think, part one is the more you regulate your emotions, the easier it is for the other person to naturally regulate their emotions. So you're not kind of escalating each other. So really practicing your skills, period, is usually going to be a helpful thing. But I would say also something that has worked for me and some clients is being more like explicitly disclosing of how I'm feeling right now. Let me tell you, oh, this conversation is stressing me out. I'm feeling more and more anxious. I don't know how you're feeling, but I need a minute to breathe. Like practice face breathing. I need to like step away for 2 minutes. I need to just like go walk around the block. Like use those distress tolerance skills. Tell them you're using them. You can ask them, do you want to breathe with me for 2 minutes? Or you can just model it and do it yourself. That is often a really effective thing of really being like talking out what skills you're practicing, inviting them to join you, or asking more explicitly, like, you seem stressed too. Is there something I can do to help you? Because, I'd like to have this conversation with you, or I'd like to do this thing. And I know that when I'm stressed, I can't pay attention. So get validation in there too.
I
love
was
that.
going to agree with Kiki. I think, and there's lots of sort of research around validating others in terms of validation's impact at like having a regulatory function. Like science is increasingly indicating that when we validate a person, and just for folks who are perhaps new to sort of this term of validation, at least within DBT, it's simply the communication and recognition that's the way that someone is feeling, perhaps thinking and or behaving, that it makes sense, that you see them. It's not about agreeing with their behavior, it's just communicating that it makes sense to you. That in and of itself can be enormously regulating for another person.
Yeah, I love what you're saying. Just to answer someone in the comments, yes, a recording of this will be made available. So don't worry if you have to jump off. You can come back and find this, as well as the mindfulness conversation that we had and the stress tolerance one that we had before that. Wolf Brown, you asked the question, how do I stop myself from doing something very stupid and impulsive when I'm feeling highly anxious? I think we touched on this before. I think that might be a good opportunity to pull out your distress tolerance skills before maybe moving into emotion regulation. Unless there's anything to add.
Wait, no,
Yeah.
Go ahead, Alicia.
No, good. No, Jesse, you were about to say something.
Well, I want to highlight, Wolf Brown, that that there's as we just talked about validation and validating another person. I think that there is a potentially dysregulating, when we're talking about emotional suffering, oftentimes emotional suffering, and what I mean by that is sort of intensifying unwanted negative emotions, will occur when we engage in self-invalidation. So for instance, like, the judgment thought, like, oh, I'm behaving quote unquote stupid, can in fact make your experience of acting on anxiety, which I bet we could all validate because we've all engaged in ineffective behaviors when we have been anxious or feeling other unwanted emotions. And when we judge that, it's like we're piling crap on top of crappy experience. Like crap is also judgment. But I think hopefully what I'm saying is making sense.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's like adding the secondary emotion onto a primary emotion, right? That you're kind of now having feelings about your feelings and can get into a spiral that way.
That's maybe a good segue, the concept of spiraling down, to another question that came up on my list here, which is, are we really honoring and feeling our emotions if we're constantly repressing their action urges?
I love this question because I get it a lot, and I actually made a video about this last week sometime, I think, because it happens all the time and I love talking about it. So, at least in DBT, right? Let's be very clear. Every single emotion regulation strategy, even the ones that are designed to reduce unwanted emotions, start with identifying the emotion you're feeling, which inherently involves feeling what you're feeling. Depending on the situation, you're going to want to sit with that emotion for minutes or seconds, but sometimes it'll be days, right? Like, these things are not mutually exclusive. In each given situation, you get to decide in your own wise mind, how much do I want to just sit and feel and process whatever that means to you, and how much do then I want to act opposite, push against, problem solve, change. And these things are what's important to recognize is sometimes we are acting opposite, as in acting differently than the emotion is making us want to feel. Sorry, opposite action is acting opposite to the urges that an emotion makes us feel like doing. So when we're scared, often we have urges to run away, and opposite action instead is to approach. So that is feels like repression, but the distinction is really different, that we still want to feel that scaredness, that fear first before acting opposite. And we're respecting and honoring and validating that emotion. If it makes sense, I'm scared. Let me find all the reasons why it makes sense I'm scared. And I'm still not going to listen to that today and act opposite.
Yeah, and I'd like to add on to that, sometimes acting on the emotion is effective depending on what the emotion is, right? So we may actually want to utilize that emotion to problem solve or to address whatever the thing is that's prompting the emotion in the first place.
And I also want to add on to that, which is that emotional suppression is not effective in the long term. We do have in distress tolerance, for instance, pushing away, in which we're literally imagining putting our emotion or our experience in a box on the wall, and we can't do that forever for a number of reasons. One, emotional suppression is actually taxing. It's like if telling yourself not to think about a pink elephant all day. You will be thinking about that pink elephant all the day, and at the same time, you'll be trying to push it away. It's like a tug of war. And so the act of emotional suppression is actually in itself both exhausting and centers at times that emotional experience.
Interesting. I have there's a related question that I'm going to ask. I do want to say, as somebody who I think there are people who have a pretty high capacity, and I'm speaking as one of these people, to push things away and set up a wall between me and it, so I really don't think about it very often. So I just want to acknowledge that I think that there is a person, or there are people out there who have a capacity to do this really effectively. It may not be a super productive thing, but I do think not everybody has that experience that you're describing.
Yes, and I think that I don't know if Kiki or Alicia want to speak to this, but I think that there's another consequence then.
What is that?
Again, it's coming back to this idea of having this idea of emotional flexibility. I think we want to be able to give ourselves permission to experience things across a continuum of intensity and positive and negative, and really be, to some extent, at times deliberate about how we're going to experience those things. So that the consequence of sort of limiting the range, okay, I don't want to feel negative affect. Well, the consequence is it requires a lot of self-monitoring, and it requires a lot of energy. And oftentimes when I see folks who, for instance, are constantly avoiding, let's say, extreme ranges of negative emotion, is that I'll also see sort of limitations in terms of the positive affect. that they'll experience.
Mhm.
So all of a sudden, sort of their emotional flexibility becomes really narrow
Mm-hmm.
and contained. And again, to Alicia's earlier point, we, negative, quote unquote, and positive, quote unquote, emotions give us really helpful information about our life worth living goals, our values, our relationships with others. So that when we begin to inhibit like a certain category of emotions, we're losing critical information.
Yeah, that's awesome.
I was going to make that point, but the other thing I will say is there is also plenty of research that shows that continual suppression of emotional and physical pain amplifies those symptoms in the long term and causes other health problems. So like people who suppress chronic pain actually report higher levels of pain across time, for example, and consistently repressing emotions or identifying like suppression as a primary emotion regulation strategy is associated with like cardiac problems and things like that. So
Okay, there's another question that I think maybe there's the last one we could take on this topic, which is, can emotion regulation skills be harmful or triggering for some individuals? If so, how can this be managed?
I think I would want more information on that.
Okay.
Can you say it again?
Yeah.
Can emotional regulation skills be harmful or triggering for some individuals? Like I think the question is trying to get at here is that like, is it possible that I could use an incorrect emotion regulation skill on a thing that could make my situation worse?
Yeah.
Yes. Or you could be invalidating yourself, right? Where, maybe the emotion, it's valid, it fit the facts, or, you're having it for a reason, going back to what I was saying before, but you're trying to use opposite action. What were you going to say, Jesse?
But Kiki, do you have something to that? So I will say this. I do think, DBT wasn't necessarily developed with folks with OCD in mind. It hasn't. There's not been a lot of research looking at the intersection, and there are some people, in fact, Andrea Gold, who we've worked with on like other stuff, who is looking at that intersection. And I have found that, for instance, like the check the facts skill can be, for folks who struggle with uncertainty and tolerance, a really almost at times problematic or used unhelpfully. I don't want to say sort of dangerous, or I forget what the triggering,
harmful.
But it can harmful. I don't know if it's harmful. I don't know if that's the right word I would use, but I think it can be problematic because a person can, for instance, okay, so check the facts is a skill where we're sort of identifying the facts of the situation without judgment or interpretation so that we can decide how we want to respond to it. And for folks who struggle with OCD, it could in many ways become almost sort of a ruminative process. I don't know, Kiki, Alicia, any thoughts on that?
I think you hit on, with specificity, the thing I was going to say in general, that I think anybody using an emotion regulation skill at a time when it is not effective to use it because the emotion is justified or something about vulnerability factors for them that day or something, it could cause more harm than help. But I wouldn't say there's like a general rule of like, this type of person should never use this skill or something like that.
Okay, I'm going to raise a question from Darsh Mallows here. So there's kind of two parts to this, but are there different types of subtypes of BPD, and are there different emotion regulation techniques that are required basically for these different subtypes?
So this is a tough area because in like the DSM, which is like the official diagnostic manual in America, at least, there are not subtypes of BPD, but there are some psychologists and certainly a lot of folks with lived experience of BPD identify different subtypes that really resonate with them. So I want to say that for the most part, there isn't like almost any research about that in terms of like what skills are best for who with different types of BPD. But a common one, for example, is like quiet BPD, which is more internalized and like less like impulsive behaviors externally. And I do think, in my experience, the folks with BPD who engage in more like external impulsive behaviors might benefit from some skills more than others. And folks with BPD who struggle more with like internalized self-hatred or perfectionism and things like that might benefit from other DBT skills. And part of that might have to do with other specific types of mental health struggles they have outside of their BPD. And I think it's one of the reasons why, for example, RODBT, radically open DBT, was created, where like the difference between whether someone has like no control over their emotions and their behaviors, or like over control and is very like tight and controlled over because of their emotions and not feeling emotions and things like that, those people are going to need different skills, different amounts. But again, I still think everything is relevant for everyone.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Kiki. Mm-hmm. So here's a more general question. If somebody like is turned on by this conversation and wants to start learning emotion regulation skills, where are they going to start? Like, what are some of the...
Roland, can you start from the beginning again?
Yeah, if there's somebody who's like hearing this conversation, okay, and they're just really inspired to say like, this stuff resonates, like, so what you're talking about resonates with me. How am I gonna start my journey trying to get information about, or which skill, is there even a skill in emotion regulation that you would recommend starting with?
I mean, my preference would be to start with the beginning of emotion regulation, of observing and describing your emotions. I mean, I do think that is a foundational place to start. If you're starting to be able to be mindful of what is I'm feeling, you know, can I name this emotion? How do I feel it in my body? Building that emotional vocabulary. So that's kind of at the beginning of our emotion regulation module, but I think that's a good place to start if you're interested. Yeah. What are your thoughts, Jesse?
So, hey, I was asked when I was applying for internship if I had to choose one DBT skill to only ever use, which one would it be? And I sort of I know we discussed this earlier, but I do think mindfulness of current emotions is kind of like it's like the big thing. And I think, Alicia, to your point, it's hard to be mindful of your emotions when you're having difficulty identifying / labeling them. So like I guess in my mind, if there's a way, and now I'm thinking about this tsunami example, which is like, you know, we don't want to necessarily have, so maybe I should qualify this. And so I don't know. That's where I'm landing, is mindfulness of current emotions.
Right. Well, isn't I think it's Marcia, the quote of like, if you can't name it, you can't regulate it, right?
Yeah.
That heard? Yeah. I don't know if that's heard.
There's
like the idea of like we need to be able to name what we're feeling in order to then make a choice on what we're going to do with
this
that.
Came up in our previous conversation. There's a famous Peter Drucker.
Name it to tame it.
Name it to tame it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Name it to tame it.
Yeah. Name it to regulate.
Yeah.
So maybe the flip side of this question about where to start. Let's think about another thing that came up was, are there common obstacles, specific obstacles to learning emotion regulation? How can they be overcome? Like, I think of this sometimes at TheraHive, we talk about the fact that we show students a picture of the learning journey. And in that picture, we show them that it's not linear. Like, you make some progress, you hit a plateau, you have a setback, you make some more progress, right? And I'm wondering, what are there bumps in the process of learning emotion regulation? What are those bumps?
Yeah, I would say some of the really foundational ones that come up most consistently for folks are, one, the questions that have come up today, like, I feel overwhelmed by emotions. I feel like I can't feel emotions without acting impulsively, right? So some of the obstacles to emotion regulation are like feeling too intensely, getting past our skills breakdown point, outside of our window of tolerance. So that's where crisis survival skills, if you like teach the tip skills first, like I often have to do, that can be a helpful thing to have online for practicing emotion regulation skills. One of the other really common blocks for folks is struggling with interoception. So interoception is the internal sensation and like awareness of physical sensations inside of our bodies, like our breath, our heartbeat, muscle tension, these types of things. And folks who are autistic, and folks who have trauma histories, and folks with chronic pain in some ways are more, and other people are more likely to struggle with interoception, and there'll have to be a lot of mindfulness practice up front of like, how am I feeling? What is here in the present moment, just to be able to practice any of the emotion regulation skills. So those are two that come to mind.
Jess, did you have something to add? I see you're thinking there. Did you want to add something?
Yeah, I mean, I think Kiki, so I like, emotions I think of as like somatic experiences. And so like interoception plays such a huge role. And I'm thinking about sort of what you're describing. There's certain folks that we know based on all sorts of factors make it that much more difficult to attune to and relate to internal somatic experiences. And I just really hadn't necessarily thought about it in that way.
Can you define somatic experience for those people who don't know that term?
Yeah, I mean, it's, if we all just took a beat right now, and you don't necessarily even have to ask yourself what you're feeling, but you can begin to just sort of sense, okay, like let's say, like, like where do you notice sensation in your body? So for instance, like right now, I'm noticing some heaviness like in my forehead. I'm noticing some tension in my shoulders. Again, as I said from the beginning, we have like a symphony of sensations going on in our body at any given moment. And oftentimes our brain does a really good job at filtering those things out. And oftentimes certain things pop up to the surface. That, in conjunction with our brain making sense of that, is oftentimes how we think of an emotion. So for instance, if I'm feeling heaviness in my chest, if I have like the urge to cry, given the context and everything, that's happening, my brain will say, oh, this is an instance of sadness. And Kiki, you offer such an interesting point, which is for folks who feel really removed from this somatic experience, it can be really hard to label that emotion.
Yeah. And to be clear, like the reason why I left it open of like some other people is autistic and neurodivergent people might be born with like less sensitivity to interoception, but other people might become less and less attuned to interoception because of trauma and dissociation or chronic pain, as I mentioned, that there's like an incentive to like disconnect from those sensations. And so there needs to be like a reconnection with basic somatic experience to be able to feel and cope with emotions.
Okay.
Can I add one thing? Because you were talking, the original question was other like things that could get in the way, right, of learning these skills. And I do think of other factors that can get in the way, or like myth that we have or belief that we have about emotion, like that we're maybe like not allowed, that feeling sad is a weakness, and that if I show sadness or vulnerability, I will be taken advantage of, or something will happen to me, right? Or maybe it's not okay, good girls don't get angry, or whatever the myth is, right? That can be going like oftentimes from our family of origin or how we grew up, that we may have internalized the thought about feelings.
Awesome. Alicia, since I've got you on the mic here, let me ask you the next question. So, people got interested in this topic, they started learning, they're going to learn some of these first skills. How do they know if they're making progress?
I mean, I think oftentimes monitoring is my favorite way to know if we're making progress. Whether that's doing a mood tracker or some kind of diary card or journaling. I mean, to know we're making progress is, well, what is the goal, right? Oftentimes we need to have a goal that we're trying to move toward. A lot of the we've been talking about some of the emotional regulation tools for reducing vulnerability that Jesse mentioned. Some of those include, being in touch with our values and building a life worth living. And, are we making progress on the things that are going to feed that bank account, right? And make us more resilient and increase our well-being overall.
Yeah. Okay, that's awesome. I think it's worth pointing out that in our program, one of the things we do at the beginning of each module is we have people set SMART goals specifically related to that module. So I think like you don't have to be in a program to do that. You can find some SMART goals for yourself. And by SMART goals, if you're not familiar with that term, that's you should Google it, but it's basically a way of defining a goal that's a measurable goal that you can hold yourself accountable to, essentially. So I encourage you to look that up and think about how you could create measures for yourself.
I also think it's helpful to also note that within motion regulation, probably more so than any other module of DBT, you're spending a lot of time identifying those goals and values. So like what are your life worth living goals, and like what are the values, the direction that you're moving towards? I think it's one of the beautiful parts about the emotion regulation module.
This is an interesting one that I feel like has come up in our conversations, Jesse, a couple of times. How important is it that I understand the mechanisms of emotions to be effective with emotion regulation skills?
Are you asking me, or?
Yeah.
I mean, like the science of emotions is under like, are you talking about like understanding like what is like the science of like emotions?
Yes.
I mean, there's such debate, and it is not a friendly debate. There are many different people who have different theories about the science of emotions. I subscribe to the constructivist model personally. So in other words, there's sort of these two big competing camps, and there's a dialectic, I'm sure. But like one competing camp says that, basically we have like fingerprints for various common emotions, like primary emotions, like sadness, anger, etc. Then there's the constructivist camp, which is like, no, there's no such thing as a universal emotion. Emotions are sort of these ways that our brain makes sense of, somatic experiences based on context, etc. Like it's a constructed experience. Now, how helpful that is in terms of how people use these skills, I don't know. I do think though the one thing that I do find helpful about the constructivist model is that, and this is my tiny call out of Marsha's DBT manual, which is that, if you go through the manual, there are very specific ways that she has categorized, and it makes sense because this is born out of a specific type of context. But like, okay, if you experience sadness, you're going to look like this, you're going to have the urge to act like this, your posture is going to be this. And I'm sure Kiki and Alicia, you can probably testify to this, whatever it is. When people experience shame, sadness, all these different things, presentation can look radically different from person to person. So I sometimes think that it's actually helpful for people to sort of develop their own emotion dictionary, sort of describing what does it look like for you when you experience anger? What is your anger urge? How do you know physiologically that anger is coming up? What are the thoughts related to it? Rather than necessarily prescribe some sort of common definition.
Interesting. Okay.
Kiki, Alicia, any thoughts on that?
Oh, 100% agree. I mean, not doing this to self-promote, but in my book, that's why like in the emotion dictionary section, I specifically like went out of my way to like have a blank space. Like, you tell me, what does this emotion feel like to you? I think that's incredibly important. Yeah, agreed.
Interesting. I don't know if this is true. I'm curious if this is true of DBT. I have a perception that DBT kind of says, look, do what's effective. You don't really have to necessarily understand why it works. If you're doing a thing that is, if you're trying a skill and the skill is working for you and helping you achieve a goal, like that's enough.
I'm with you, Roland. I think sometimes we can get into analysis paralysis, and oftentimes just being able to do something that's effective, why, get into overanalyzing it.
Kiki, I'm looking at your expression. I'm curious what you're thinking.
So interesting, and it resonates with me because I think I don't operate that way. I think I really like knowing how things work in order to know like whether I want to do it or not. And I'm like hesitant to just do it without understanding why you're suggesting I do it. So, and I think I have learned to teach skills accordingly. and I think my point is like, oh yeah, like I've gone out of my way to like go and read all of the references for all of the skills in the skills manual because
Yeah.
I didn't just like take her word for it. But so it is very much written like, yeah, do this thing, it works, trust me.
I do think that there's a bit of a dialectic here.
Right.
Like on the one hand, like I I don't want to be like, I mean, as like a cismet, like I don't want to be paternalistic and just be like, hey, do this skill because I say so. Because I think that's kind of fucked up. It's like, yeah, like let me give you the information and you decide. And
Mm-hmm.
on the other hand, to Alicia, your point, like as someone that works with a lot of clients who have
So you're in a different corner than before. We're gonna let me do a quick intro here just to get people on the same page. Actually, before I do that, let me just remind you all about where we were to bring us back before the power outage. So, Jesse, you were actually talking, and we'd had a couple of back and forths about. I raised a point where I had shared that, from my perspective, my understanding of DBT was that it was kind of putting forth this idea that you don't necessarily have to understand why these skills work. If they work for you, that is enough. And from there, Alicia, you said some things, and I think that's a great place for us to potentially pick up our conversation. And for those listeners who are joining us right now, this is a continuation, a wrap up of an Instagram Live that we did a couple of days ago, thus the change of scenery and the change of position here because my power went out and that disrupted our Instagram Live. So we're going to put a bow on this conversation about emotion regulation and pick up where we left off, which, let me just restate that question or restate that prompt for you, Jesse, which was I had said previously that if a skill works for you, that's the most important thing. It doesn't necessarily require that you understand everything that's going on underneath the surface or understand the mechanism and so on. And you were sharing your thoughts on that topic.
Yeah. Firstly, can I just Kiki or Alicia, do you have it all any initial thoughts related to that?
Well,
I'm go ahead.
sure. Yeah, I do have some thoughts. I mean, I think we human, I'll speak for myself, but oftentimes we do like to understand why something works or how it works in order to even be motivated to try it.
Yeah.
So I think it is dialectical in that way that, you know, being able to understand, I'm also thinking about DBT assumptions, understanding the causes, right, of things works much better, and understanding those causes in terms of creating change than like blaming, right, or getting into judgment about things, but really understanding the mechanisms of like what's happening, like things are happening for a reason, right? Simultaneously, I guess the other side of the dialectic is sometimes, right, we can, if we know that, hey, if I do this thing, even though I don't fully understand why it's helping me, it's making me feel better and less likely to engage in ineffective behavior or make the situation worse, then yes, am I willing to try it and do it? So I'm kind of holding the both end in that answer.
I think that that's where I land as well. Like I do think that there's a bit of a dialectic here, which is like on the one hand, you know, when we think about skills, we're also thinking about skills deficits. So to some extent, it's helpful to understand our areas of weaknesses so that we can figure out where and how we can intervene. And, you know, oftentimes working with folks sort of at the intersection of emotion dysregulation and sort of either intrusive thoughts or compulsive behaviors, that quest to understand can at times get in the way of actually using the skills. Mm-hmm. So I think that there's a line between like information seeking and reassurance seeking. Mm-hmm. Am I looking to understand how this skill works so that, and like, am I satisfied with an answer versus is seeking an answer sort of serving some sort of other function.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we can get caught in like analysis paralysis where we're starting to like overanalyze things, right? Or kind of get caught up in more rumination, which may not be effective or helpful.
Yeah.
Okay, nice. Anything to add, Kiki? Does that sound good?
Yeah. No, I guess I do have something to add. I end up in the both and situation as well, in the sense of this is not an emotion regulation skill, but it's a useful teaching example here of like the tip your temperature skill works whether or not you know how it works, because like your body has the mammalian dive reflex. And I don't know, there's reason to believe that understanding how it works might help it work better, placebo effect and all, right? So, and understanding how it works might make you be willing to do something that's as uncomfortable, sticking your face in the bowl of ice. Like, yeah, there's a lot of interplay here.
Yeah. You're just also reminding me of a general assumption that I have, which is that like we just don't really understand that much about the way the world and our brains work when it comes down to it. Like there's just, this is an area of science. Just, yeah, science is still relatively scratching the surface. We don't really deeply understand a lot of the mechanisms of this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I know I'm only going to add one or two questions here because we should be wrapping up. There was one that we didn't get to, which was, is it possible to overuse emotion regulation skills in like a maladaptive way?
I mean, I think that you can use emotion regulation skills ineffectively, and that would be maladaptive. And then, therefore, I guess you could be overusing them. But it's not so much about overuse as much as just like ineffective use. So, like, if your emotion fits the facts and is based on reality, and there's something in reality that's problematic, harmful, hurtful for you, often we don't want you to just keep acting opposite to the emotion. Like we want you to address reality or change it in some way. And if you just like would constantly move to opposite action as a way to reduce that negative emotion, first of all, you might be like invalidating yourself consistently, which might increase the emotional pain. You want to be solving the problem that's in reality. You just might end up doing a lot of ineffective things in the process of that. So that wouldn't be an overuse of opposite action as much as just like not using it at the most effective time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I was thinking about pre-skills. Like, I mean, pre-skills is all about balance of those things, but I could imagine, right? I mean, there is such a thing as like over-exercising. Like exercise is great for our mental health, but if you're spending 3 to 4 hours in the gym every single day and like not eating enough, like, or, like you could get obsessive about it or misuse it in a way that would take you out of balance.
I think, Roland, like when like implicit in the question is like what are the goals? Like we evaluate the effectiveness of a skill if it's helping you move towards your life worth living goals. So if you're engaging in skills use that is taking you away from those goals, then calling it maladaptive, calling it whatever, it's not proving to be effective for you in that way. So that's sort of how we evaluate whether something is helpful or not.
Okay. I've got one more question, and then I'd love to turn it over to you all. If there are any closing thoughts that you want to leave somebody with as they start thinking about embarking on their study of emotion regulation. The last question that I had was, what guidance would you give somebody who's done some reading, watched this conversation, and started to put emotion regulation skills to work, and is just discovering like they're not getting a benefit, or it's not working for them? What would you tell them to do next?
I mean, I would often, when clients come to me and tell me that the skills are not working, is first getting curious about what did they mean by not working. because sometimes we can think like, oh, I'm going to use the skill and I'm going to immediately feel better. And sometimes, first of all, the skills may be just reducing your temperature, right? It may not be solving your life problems, right? And there could be lots of different skills that are needed to get to that life worth living or build, toward those goals. Like Jesse was saying, like, is it effectively moving you toward your goals of where you want to be? And there may need to be multiple skills being actually implemented. And am I using the right skill? Like, or am I using skill and expecting a certain result? And maybe I need to get curious about which skill I'm using when, and how I'm actually applying that skill.
Okay. Anything else to add? Any other closing thoughts you want to share with folks tuning in here about emotion regulation?
I'm looking at my laptop trying to find emotion regulation handout 24. Troubleshooting emotion regulation skills and what you're not doing when what you're doing isn't working. So I'd also refer people to that one to figure out what's going on.
Totally. There is, just for those who don't have the full context here, Kiki is referencing the DBT skills workbook, which I don't know if that's like freely accessible online, but I know that you can get a copy of it really at low cost. You can buy, this is a book that you can buy on Amazon. There are also like other people who have taken this worksheet, including TheraHive. Like we have our own version of that worksheet, which you can find available for free online. So if you just Google basically troubleshooting for emotion regulation, you'll probably find one of these worksheets that might be a good guide for you.
Do we have that on the Pocket Guide on our website and TheraHive?
Not yet, not for emotion regulation. Kiki, do you have it for your book?
I don't remember. I have, I don't know if I'm allowed to give specifics yet. I have something else coming out later this year where I know it's included. But
oh, that's exciting.
Nice. Cool. Awesome. Sounds good. Well, that's a good teaser, maybe conversation on. Okay. Well, in that case, let me stop. Jesse, Alicia, Kiki, thank you for spending an hour together to talk about emotion regulation. This has been an amazing conversation. And for those of you who are tuning in, we are going to do one more of these conversations. And the focus of that conversation is going to be interpersonal effectiveness. And that'll probably happen within a month's time. So I'm super excited to close out our conversations across the 4 modules very soon with interpersonal effectiveness. So thanks again.
Thanks.
Thank you. Awesome conversation.
Yes.